This video is for teachers who are looking for an overview of the Unit 2 assessment, which, if you are following the Passport to Social Studies curriculum, is slated to be completed over a 3-day period between days 24 and 26. In this assessment, the students will read, analyze, categorize, and synthesize information from primary sources to write a historical argument in response to this focus question: what caused the end of chattel slavery in the United States? Day 1 begins with the students reviewing the Unit 2 assessment, namely the overview and task on the first 2 pages, and posting questions they have, which will then be discussed as a class. I'm going to pull up the student-facing document right here, and I'm going to highlight some of the things that you may want to emphasize in case it does not come up in this discussion. And first, I would draw the students' attention to this part, this sentence right here. And it's going to explain to them that their argument is going to need to be supported by different types of causal reasoning, such as long and short-term causes, along with triggers. And this is something that they have practiced many times prior to this. Second, I would also make sure that my students are aware of the dichotomous nature of this question. We can see here they are given 2 options: human agency of African Americans or President Abraham Lincoln. Human agency likely has come up several times during this course, but it may be beneficial for students to be reminded of its definition or provided with illustrative examples. You can either call on volunteers to share these, or you can provide them yourself. After also ensuring that the students peruse part 2, which lays out the requirements and is basically also kind of an outline for the essay that they're going to ultimately write, I would direct their attention to the rubric that appears on page 8, which I'm going to scroll down to right now. And I know that rubrics are incredibly word dense and sometimes overwhelming for students to read, but I would encourage them to at least read this leftmost column, where the broad historian skills are listed. And if I had the time available, knowing the areas where my own students struggle, I would instruct them to really focus on these first 4 targets and what meeting standards looks like for each one of them. For some students, this may be a target. For others, it may kind of be like a what do I need to do to go above and beyond. From there, the students read and annotate the 2 anchor texts, one by Barbara Fields and the other by James McPherson, both of whom are very accomplished and respected historians. As the students read these texts, there are guiding prompts on the right, as well as space for them to gather evidence. The last line of the headnote of each text informs the students as to which perspective the author supports. And if you want to provide your students with a little more focus for their annotations, you could direct them to look for evidence supporting that respective author's claims. Since this part of the assessment is really just providing students with the background knowledge and nothing up to this point is assessed via the rubric, you may decide, time permitting of course, that it is in your students' best interest to engage with these texts in a more interactive, collaborative manner. Since both will be used to really inform their decision as to whether it was human agency or structural change, you could opt to include a brief pair or even a small group activity that allows students to share their initial thoughts. Whatever you decide on, it should be focused on the students sharing their ideas and not coming to consensus or purposefully changing their peers' minds. Examples include having the students create and share questions that they'd like to ask either of the authors, or creating a think, pair, share activity centered on which evidence from each author they found most convincing. The critical reading for argument tool, which we can see right here, is a great protocol that will walk students through the process of sizing up the arguments of both authors while informing them how to address confirmation bias and positionality. Parts of it will be done before, during, and after reading each anchor text, so they will have to use this tool twice. And I really like what it says right here about how this tool is going to slow the whole process down for them and help them take note of each of the author's arguments and guide them through the analysis and evaluation of each author's claims. When introducing this tool to students for the first time, I would also draw their attention to this line because it really does kind of encapsulate the entire premise of the protocol here. And I would also consider facilitating a brief discussion about the difference between explicit and implicit arguments, and even maybe providing an example or 2. And while this tool will take some time, it is incredibly important that in the process, because it does allow students to not only recognize the arguments made, but also consider the author's objectives and what each has chosen to include and exclude, as well as the impact that this may have on the reliability of their source, which ultimately is going to lead the students to decide which one is going to be the basis of their own thesis. Day one ends with the students using both articles and both critical reading tools to inform their decision about what their thesis will be. And if necessary, steps 1 and 2 of the thesis statement tool can also help guide them through that process. Day 2 begins with the students recollecting what their theses are, as well as hypothesizing 2 primary sources that would help them support their argument. And this last prompt is meant to get students thinking about the type of useful primary sources out there, because they will have the option of locating their own sources for this assessment, which we'll talk about more in just a moment. To support students with this question, you may find it useful to create 2 student-generated class lists, one of types of primary sources and the other about individuals or groups who may have unique insight relating to the historical question at the center of this assessment, and then allow students to kind of mix and match them. And the purpose of this is to focus their hypotheticals into sources that may actually be realistic and may actually exist, which is going to be especially useful if they do opt to locate their own. The next step is for students to select the 4 sources that will be used to provide supporting evidence for their thesis. On this slide, we see the 7 that are provided. Some the students have seen already, like the Emancipation Proclamation and the Declaration of South Carolina's secession. Some of them are new, like Nat Turner's revolt and General Butler's reaction to self-emancipating slaves. There are also a variety of types of sources available here. We have maps and images and texts. And the students will need to be given time to peruse these, determine which are the most relevant to supporting their thesis, and ultimately they need to make their selections. And also, like it says up here, you can adjust the number that the students use based on the unique needs of your students and your class dynamics. For students who opt to locate their own sources, there are online databases, repositories, and libraries they can use to find primary sources. Some include docsteach.org, the Library of Congress, and teachingamericanhistory.org. However, students would greatly benefit from being familiar with these sites before undertaking this option as part of their assessment. To help them consider how the author's purpose, perspective, bias, and audience affect the reliability of whatever primary source they're looking at, you may also want to have the sourcing and evaluating reliability tool available for them to use. To help students find reliable secondary sources, you should direct them to use the 4 moves plus 1 habit flowchart. There is the flowchart available, and there is also a more text-based version, which you can see here. And whichever one that the students use, it should not be the first time that they see these. If possible, you might want to build these into lessons leading up to the assessment. And once they make their selections, slides 28 through 31 are designed to guide the students' assessment of each of these sources. But please just be mindful that slides 29 through 31 are needed for each online source they pick. So extra copies will be needed to be made accordingly. Once the students have their sources selected and vetted if they pick their own, the next step is to complete part 1 of the assessment, which is the reading organizer, which we can see right here. And I think it's important for students to see why this is such an important part of the pre-writing process. So before getting started, I would draw their attention to this line. And then I would explain to them that even though all their sources likely support their thesis, each one offers different reasons or unique insight, which will really strengthen their written work. And this is the place where they can start to identify these things. Also, I would remind them that they are expected to incorporate multiple causes into their writing, whether it's long, short term, or triggers. And this organizer might actually help them with that as well. And once this reading organizer is completed on day 2, from here, the students should be in a really strong position to actually write their essay on day 3. Just before they begin, you might want to have the students again look at that kind of outline that's provided on page 2 of the assessment. And afterwards, you can have them use the rubric as a checklist prior to submitting their work. And you can even have them self-assess and self-reflect using this slide here.